Hello, and welcome to The Real Economy, focus on the middle market and the economic headwinds facing it. I'm Darby Dunn, the moderator for today's event, and today we're going to be focusing on the big questions looming about potential recession, the issue of inflation, and even the potential for a nationwide rail strike. Joining me now are Joe and Neil of The Joe and Neil Show, Joe Brusuelas, RSM's chief economist, and Neil Bradley of the Chamber of Commerce. Great to see you guys. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving and kick off to the holiday season.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Pretty good Thanksgiving.
Good. So much to get to. As I was preparing for today, I was looking, there's so much economic data, even over the next 3 days. Then we've got the Fed meeting in the middle of the month. I want to talk about all of that, but I want to start, since it's in the news, with this rail strike. There's a potential for a strike December 9th or 10th, I think, is
December 9th.
December 9th is the drop dead date. And I think you've described it as potentially catastrophic.
Oh, absolutely.
So walk us through what the potential catastrophe is and what the likelihood is that this could be resolved. I know there's interventions now.
And movement even last night. So when you think about the scale of how important the rail system is, you're talking about 40% of freight traffic in the United States moves by rail. It's not just finished goods, it's a lot of inputs for factories, all the way to the water that comes out of your tap. We kind of take clean drinking water for granted. Well, the reason we have clean drinking water is because chlorine travels by rail to your local water treatment plant. And so in a national rail strike, all of that comes to a halt. Not to mention Amtrak, commuter rails all come to a stop. So you're looking we think about economic impacts of about $2 billion a day initially with a rail strike. It would obviously keep accelerating if it goes on for any period of time. So that's the reason we call it catastrophic in terms of its impact.
And what are the chances that it will actually happen? I mean, I know there are efforts underway to prevent it.
Yeah, so we actually have about a 100-year-old process in the United States for managing rail labor disputes. And we've been going through that process since the summer. Where we ended up was a deal that was negotiated with the assistance of President Biden between the railroads and the 12 unions. That was done in September. Since September, 8 of the 12 unions have agreed to the terms of that deal. 4 have rejected it. The next step in that process, if you want to avoid a rail strike, is for Congress to do what it's done on 18 prior occasions and to intervene. Last night, President Biden asked Congress to intervene, recommended that they intervene to impose the deal that was agreed on back in September. And then since then, you've already seen Speaker Pelosi, the Democratic leadership in the Senate indicate that they'll be moving on that this week. So absent any strange turn of events or people getting cold feet on Capitol Hill, I think they will successfully pass legislation ratifying the September deal and avoiding a rail strike.
Okay, well, that would have a lot of people breathing a sigh of relief because people are concerned about recession and where the economy is going. Bring us up to date of where you see the economy right now. If you give us a little health check, and I know you are more the voice of reason, where you see the potential for a recession, how long, when, and how deep.
Okay, so right now the economy is doing actually quite well. It's likely to grow just under 3% in the third quarter, and we're looking probably closer to 2 to 2.5% in the final 3 months of the year, probably with a little bit of upside risk around holiday spending if we don't get that rail strike. And we can't overstate just how important that is because railroads touch everything in the entire economy. So if that's avoided, we're going to have a fairly strong close to the year. Now, we've got a 65% probability of a recession next year. We think that it's likely, if one's going to happen, it won't occur until probably the second half of the year at this point. And it's likely the duration and depth is likely to be 2 quarters and fairly shallow. One of the things that I think is occurring is you're seeing some pent-up demand being released for manufactured goods in the auto sector. And then we're going to see a fairly large increase in defense spending. So there's going to be sort of a floor put under the economy just because we're catching up from some of the unique properties of the pandemic, and the geopolitical tensions are altering the behavior of the government. In other words, the government's going to be engaged in defense spending, which in other words might be sort of a backdoor stimulus package. So even if the economy does slow and it ends up being flat to moderately negative, we're just not expecting a really big increase in the unemployment rate. We're only at 4.6% by the end of next year, and we put that in perspective. 4.4% is full employment. So the economy is undergoing some really profound structural changes, and that recession won't look like your father's recession or your grandfather's recession.
I want to get more into that and the structural changes that you've written quite about a lot about. But in prior webcasts that we've done, our listeners always want your predictions for the next Fed move on rates. So I'm just going to get to that question. And listeners, you can start sending in your questions. I'll start monitoring them here on my handy dandy iPad and try to get them to Neil and Joe. But let's go to that question. We had the last 4 moves were 75 basis points. The Fed meets again December 13th and 14th. We've got the Fed funds rate around 3.75 to 4. You see, I did my homework. I wrote down the numbers. We've got GDP coming out tomorrow, right? Is that the revised second number?
Second estimate on the third quarter, yeah.
Friday, non-farm payrolls, and the PCE is coming out as well.
That's right.
So that's all data that the Fed looks at. So what do you think they'll do in the next meeting, the mid-December? How big a raise will they do?
They're slowing the pace of rate hikes to restore price stability. So instead of 75 basis point, you'll see a 50 basis point hike, and then in January and March, you'll get 2 25 basis point hikes. And I think that will establish a peak rate of 5 to 5.25%. And essentially, the policy framework for 2023 is going to be lift and hold. They're going to lift rates, and then they're going to hold them there to ascertain the lagged impact of past rate hikes on the real economy. And we'll see how the base effects on goods and energy inflation respond through the middle of next year. So we expect by the end of next year, the core PCE rate, that's the policy variable the Fed uses, should be around 3%. Now, at that point, my sense is the central bank will call it a day. They'll declare victory, and then they'll begin talking about rate cuts. And so this is going to be a year of transition in many ways for the economy as it absorbs the past impact of those policy hikes and then sets up for 2024, where you're going to get some stimulus via the monetary channel. And you'll probably see asset prices late next year accelerate.
So sometimes I read articles that say rates could go as high as 7%.
Yeah.
You don't think that's going to happen?
No, I think that inside the real economy, the core goods inflation has now turned negative on a 3-month average annualized pace. Actually, it declined by 2.6% over the past 3 months. So you're going to see a little bit of goods disinflation. The problem is the Fed has to make a very difficult judgment call on when will rents peak. That's what we call the cost of shelter, housing owner's equivalent rent. Our research tells us early in the third quarter of next year. Once they're absolutely certain that it's plateaued, and then it's going to come down, then the policy environment gets a bit more friendly, at least from the central banking side of the equation.
Neil, do you want to debate any of those predictions, or do you feel that's about?
I think Joe's got a square on the head. I think, an interesting thing that gets lost sometimes, particularly in the public debate, is people confuse what's going on in the real economy and the real data with the headlines that they see on the news or what they read in the paper. And so, you could be forgiven if you're just watching cable news or not one of the economic stations, or if you're not reading Joe, to think, my goodness, we're already in a deep recession. The economy's horrible. How could they increase rates again? Well, they're increasing rates again because in the real economy, things are still pretty strong, and the Fed still has some work to do. And so I think this is a unique time in which there's probably more of a disconnect than usual between people's perceptions of the economy and what's actually happening. And thankfully, the Fed is going to be really driven by what's actually happening.
And you get some great insight from the Middle Market Business Index survey. You have some of the collected data from that. Share some highlights of the latest findings.
It's describing a very resilient economy, but one that's cooled off a bit from the torrid pace we saw in the third quarter of the year. I think that people have soured on the economy in some respects because of inflation, right? Now, we're seeing the first signs of some problems of passing along the price increases, right? But still, a majority of respondents are able to pass along those price increases because U.S. households are flush with cash. We took a look at sort of the savings data, and what we saw is the two upper quartiles, basically the well-to-do and the wealthy, are sitting on $1.3 trillion of cash. Well, that's a lot of money. And if they just spend a little bit of it, it's going to basically put a floor underneath the economy, which is why we're not anywhere near a recession as we sit here today right now. And that's good news, and it can't be stated enough.
But middle market businesses, if I understood the answers correctly, they are a little bit more pessimistic than they were before.
There's no question that pessimism is creeping into the outlook. And you have to differentiate a little bit between what's happening today, in which one of the major problems is the overhang from the pandemic and supply chain challenges, but also pent-up demand. You talk to a lot of them, they're still working through the demand that's been accumulated and the demand that continues to come in because of the pent-up savings that Joe was talking about. Now, it's not true across every industry, and so sometimes you have to begin breaking out what's happening in manufacturing versus residential construction, for example. And so, we have to caveat some of this. But the future outlook actually kind of coincides with what Joe described. An economy that's softening, an economy that's going to have a shallow recession second half of next year, but that is not going to be a repeat of the Great Recession, or frankly, most of the periods of rate increases that we've experienced in our lifetimes.
Okay. We're getting some questions in from our viewers right now. The first one, I'll ask you, Joe. The estimate of 4.6 unemployment, does that anticipate any plus or minus change in labor force participation rate?
Right. No, the labor force participation rate's largely going to remain where it's at. You may see a little bit of a decline once we see the release of workers, particularly in residential construction. We're already seeing layoffs and hiring freezes in the tech industry, obviously in finance. But what we're really waiting on is to see sort of the collateral damage from the rate hikes in the housing industry. Because if there's one industrial sector that I'm absolutely confident that's in recession now, it's housing. They need to finish up the projects that are in the pipeline. Then early next year, you'll begin to see residential construction hiring turn negative.
Okay, so the construction hiring turns negative. This is something we've talked about in prior webcasts a lot, about how there are 2 jobs for every one human or one potential worker in the United States. Where do you see that going in the next year?
Well, unfortunately, we haven't gotten back to a labor force participation rate that we had pre-pandemic.
So we're not going to have enough people to fill the jobs in the country going forward for a number of years. During my entire lifetime, for most of it, we added about 1% to the labor force every year. It was a little like the sun coming up and going down. You could count on it like death and taxes. Well, that's slowed to a crawl. It's almost no growth right now. And because we're at a political impasse on the relief valve that immigration used to be into the country, we're going to be in a situation where there's just not going to be enough physical workers to meet the demand. Okay, what's that going to look like? Well, if you think about the economy, growth's a function of productivity and growth in the labor force. Well, if the labor force isn't growing, we're going to have to focus on productivity. So that means a lot more investment in capital expenditure, software, intellectual property, and equipment. That means a lot more automation. One of the cool things about my job is I get to travel all around our economy and all around the world. You visit our friends in Japan who've been going through a broad demographic challenge for about 30 years now. One of the things you notice is the ubiquity of vending machines, very sophisticated automation everywhere. Because firms, once they learn something, they tend to put it into practice. And we learned a lot during the pandemic, how we can work from home, how we can work remotely, how we can have the Zoom economy in many respects, right, in terms of communication. So going forward, because we're not going to have enough people, we're going to be investing a lot more in our firms in order to produce more goods, because we're not going to have the physical capacity in terms of people to do it.
So that's something that you're calling on middle market businesses to prepare for and to forge ahead with investment and technological innovation even though it might feel a little nerve-wracking to do so because of all this talk of recession and headlines about, kind of bad news in the economy. Talk to us a little bit more about what businesses should be doing as far as, and that was something that came up in the survey. Businesses want to, get some information about digital transformation, continuing to push that, but within budgetary pressures.
Yeah, I think it's important for businesses right now to think a little bit more medium and long term, because what Joe described as the pressures on the labor force aren't going away, right? So we're still going to have these demographic challenges. So you're entering a moment in which your inclination may be, we got to really pull back on investment. We don't really know where this is going to be. In some ways, that's a reasonable decision for businesses to make. But in other ways, it might be the opportune time to be making investments in automation to get the efficiency so that when that shallow recession starts turning positive, you're prepared to capitalize it. I would not want to be in a situation where I'm in the first half of 2024, maybe the second half of 2024, where demand is ramping back up and I have opportunities in my business. I can't get the people to meet them, and it's too late to make the capital investments in software and in automation to seize the opportunity. So I would tell companies, you think closely. Imagine, figure out if you have the wherewithal to do it, and if you do, don't shy away from addressing these labor force challenges by improving efficiency and CapEx.
And I really do understand the role of uncertainty in terms of how small and medium-sized enterprises operate. If you're uncertain around the depth and duration of the recession, I understand the first instinct is to pull back. Focus on core sales, don't innovate, don't invest, wait till the other side of the downturn. I don't think that's an option this time. I really don't. You're not going to be set up to thrive on the other side of this downturn, that you have to continue to make those forward-looking investments in order to increase your efficiencies and to increase productivity. Most importantly, this is what you have to do when you have a downturn driven by inflation. And that's why when I mentioned earlier, this isn't going to be your father's recession, because we haven't had a recession driven by inflation, well, since I was a child.
Well, speaking of inflation, one of the viewers asked, is the new inflation target now 3% versus the standard 2%? And when does the Fed acknowledge this?
Okay, so the Fed intends to bring inflation back to the 2% target, and they're going to say that until they ex post declare victory and say, well, maybe we're okay with 3%. No, there's a real argument for this. One is we need to generate a quicker churn in the economy to create the conditions whereby we can finance the retirement of the baby boom. It's not Social Security. Neil and I can go in a back room with a couple senators. We can fix this today. Medicare is a bit more substantial problem. Then it's going to be almost impossible to increase the unemployment rate to get the inflation rate down to 2% because we just don't have enough people. So conditions are coalescing whereby the Fed probably will want to think about lifting that inflation target to 3 or even 4%. Olivier Blanchard, the award-winning economist, has got a great piece in Financial Times. I encourage everybody to read it. And he's saying that, the public, when inflation is running between 3 and 4%, really don't notice. It's when it's above that they do.
When they really, yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised sometime in 2024, the Fed lifts the inflation target to 3%, ex post, not ex ante, and we'll all live with it.
So it's currently, inflation's running at 7.7%. Yeah. The October data came in a little bit better than expected, and people got a little bit excited, like maybe inflation is finally, what's your take? Do you think we're on a trend where inflation is decreasing? And do you think that inflation will go to about 3-4% at the beginning of 2024? All
right, so I think that inflation's peaked. Okay, good. That's a good start. But inflation's moved into the service sector. It's a lot more persistent and proving more difficult to corral than I think policymakers judged a year and a half, 2 years ago. Okay, we all made that mistake. Fine, now we got to get on with it. The underlying pace of inflation looks to me to be somewhere between 4 and 5% right now. It's going to be difficult to get it to 2, right? But so Neil mentioned this earlier, there's a lot of heavy lifting to do in terms of the monetary portion of the equation, and the Fed's got to go ahead and just keep hiking rates, reducing its balance sheet, and then hope for a little bit of help on the supply side from the federal government. If there is a recession, and we really don't talk about it in this country, and they don't talk about it in this town enough, that there are supply side solutions. One of which we have an incredible amount of money in the pipeline on infrastructure. It makes sense to pull that forward. A rational supply side response to inflation, it would be perfectly timed. And if there is a downturn, that can be a form of stimulus that I think everybody can get behind. And it seems to me that that's what's going to have to occur.
Since we're in D.C. and we've got the end of this legislative session, I know you issued a letter of priorities that the Chamber wants to see lawmakers work on, including some that are tax initiatives that would help middle market businesses. Walk us through those and how likely you think they may occur.
Yeah, well, we have a number of provisions, particularly from the 2017 tax reform law, that have begun expiring, and they get to a lot of these efficiency issues that Joe was mentioning. So, we want people to immediately be able to deduct their R&D expenses because they're making those investments in new innovation. So we now move to a more amortization schedule of that. We want to get that back to full expensing it in the first year. We also are facing the reductions in your ability to expense your CapEx and returning to a more traditional deduction schedule. Obviously, that makes the cost of your CapEx more expensive after tax. And so getting those things extended, we think, is really important. Listen, I think the outlook in this town is difficult. It's a politically difficult environment. I would not be surprised if we wrap up this Congress with a whole host of fiscal issues, not just the tax issues, but what the top line spending levels are for the federal government for the next year, all kicked in to the next Congress. I think this will dominate a lot of the discussion for the first maybe 3 quarters of next year, where we will have a robust and healthy debate about what we need to do to incentivize investment, how we need to deal with the debt and deficit because of the debt limit, and setting overall spending levels. So I think to the audience, I would say this is likely to be continued.
How likely do you think it is that the EBITDA and the R&D expense provisions will go the way the Chamber would like to see it?
I think ultimately they go the way the Chamber would like to see it.
By the end of the year.
I think the odds are diminishing that we get there by the end of the year. You have political factors, including a runoff in Georgia, a very narrow House majority where you have to get through the election of a speaker on January 3rd. And so despite a lot of good intentions by lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, we're falling back into a habit that, frankly, we've been in for the last 20 years, where rather than doing big deals in a lame duck where you've had a change in control, you simply kick them into the new Congress. You literally have to go back to George W. Bush in the 2000 election, which was the last time that you had a major fiscal decisions and a change in control where the incoming party, in that case the presidency, said, hey, let's clear the decks and let's get all this stuff done. The tendency has been for both Republicans and Democrats to take their bite at the apple in the new Congress or the new administration, and that's going to be true again.
And the theme for the next Congress, 2023, gridlock is what everybody's saying, and usually businesses, at least Wall Street, likes gridlock. But for middle market businesses, what do you foresee?
Well, Gridlock has a certain negative connotation to it, obviously. I wouldn't describe it as gridlock. What I would describe as the era of uniparty legislating, meaning where one party gets to write it just the way that they want it and impose it on the rest of the nation, is over. If anything's going to get enacted, it's going to get enacted because there's a bipartisan agreement. That's ultimately good for business because it means the policy is more durable, that we won't be enacting something and then spending the next 2 years arguing over whether we should undo the thing that was just done. I think for the middle market, the hope is that we can address these tax issues and tax incentives that we talked about and begin to make progress on immigration. We're not going to get the immigration relief valve that we truly need, but at this point, any relief is helpful. And you're already seeing bipartisan negotiations, starting with agriculture workers, where there's an emerging agreement between Republicans and Democrats. I think we'll expand that into construction, because, by the way, we need those folks to help build that, all the stuff that we funded in that infrastructure bill and all those energy projects that are going to get tax benefits under the Inflation Reduction Act. So you'll start to see a synergy form around those things. And I think that'll be good for the economy and good for the middle market.
And that will be immigrant workers who come in on visas, on work programs for construction, that kind of thing?
Larger than visas, it'll be skills-based. They'll have a great debate about permanency and the path to citizenship and all of those elements of it. But I think you'll see a growing recognition that bringing more people in, both at the high-tech skills and programming, but also in construction skills, will be more of a focus.
One of the bad ideas we have is we educate people and let them go back. We need to stop doing that. Yeah, no, it would make much more sense that they stay and increase our efficiency and our productivity, help us bring inflation down.
Our friends in Canada are actively recruiting as we educate people and tell them that they have to go back wherever they're from. And Canada says, well, you could just move up here.
On Palo Alto Boulevard in Silicon Valley, there's a billboard, and it's sort of basically, it's the country of Canada telling people, if you're having problems, yeah. And when you go to Toronto, as you know, I'm there on business quite a bit, there is a dynamic temperature on the ground. You can see it, you can feel it, you can taste it. It's happening, right? And that's what's supposed to happen here, but it's not right now.
I don't want to get too into the political weeds, though, but there is, and you see it in the media, tremendous anti-immigrant sentiment in this country as well. And you see stories about the invasion at the border and the buses being sent to New York and the flights to Martha's Vineyard. That has to make immigration reform or changes a lot more difficult to get done.
Certainly makes it more difficult. But it also creates opportunity for compromise, right? So you look like a Senator Mark Kelly, Democrat, just reelected in the state of Arizona. His fellow senator from Arizona is also a Democrat, Kristen Sinema, who will be up in the next cycle. Both of them have been working with Republicans like John Cornyn from Texas about sensible things that you can do with the border. You can imagine a scenario where there's sensible border changes that address a very, very real problem, you know, that we don't have operational control over the southern border, combined with legal pathways for people to come in and work, combined with pathways for people who have legitimate asylum and refugee claims to come into the United States. So I mentioned ag workers earlier. The agreement there, more people coming in to help in the agriculture industry in exchange for more employer verification to make sure that they came through a legal process. That's the kind of trade-offs you're going to start getting.
Interesting. Okay, let's get back to some of the viewers' questions. This one's been here for a while, so I'll get to it. Will the cost of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIP Act, support of Ukraine, et cetera, and higher interest rates on the U.S. budget prolong any recession and keep inflation higher?
No, I would think it'd be just the opposite. If you're having a problem with inflation, you want to approach it from the supply side, right? So that means more infrastructure. That means more environmental infrastructure. Okay, second, if it's true that the weapon stock has been depleted, and I believe what they say over at the Pentagon, it needs to be replenished. You know, sometimes you just get lucky. And if you're going to have a slowdown in the economy, priming the pump with a little defense spending makes a lot of sense, right? And I think it'll help offset the inevitable slowdown that you're going to see due to the uncertainty that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion, particularly in Washington and politics today, between spending from the federal government. This is designed to increase the capacity of the economy, its ability to supply things, and spending that a government does to boost demand. And that confusion can lead to some bad policy choices. So the idea of boosting demand right now and the federal government or state governments taking actions to put more money out there to increase aggregate demand, we don't need any of that.
Okay.
What we do need is the type of investments that we happen to get on the energy side and on the infrastructure side to make things that make our economy more efficient. And when you're more efficient, you have better supply, and it's deflation.
We need roads, we need bridges, we need ports, we need broadband. That's right. And unfortunately, when I say supply side, most people, why aren't you talking about a tax cut? No, I'm actually talking about increasing the capacity of the economy to produce, right? Unfortunately, I'm just old enough to remember the weekend that they opened the Golden State Highway in California where they connected LA and Orange County with San Diego. Parents put me in the back of the Datsun and we went to SeaWorld, right? Now, today, you say that to somebody, they're like, what do you mean, those roads weren't there? No, they weren't always there. There was a time when the government had to do these things, and unfortunately, because we really haven't invested in our infrastructure over past decades, we've reached that point again. But now we have a rationale to accelerate it because we have this inflation issue.
What impact do you see the student loan forgiveness program having on the economy, on inflation, if it proceeds? This was another very controversial topic.
Next to none, because it's so small in terms of a $23 trillion economy. That's more about, it's more about politics and the impact on those individuals' lives who have those student loans. It's not going to have any significant economic impact. It's about the politics of it, which Neil can address, and about those households.
Do you want to talk about the politics of it?
Like everything, it's become politicized. You know, listen, this is, I mentioned a benefit of divided control in government is that you forge consensus that's more durable. I think the reason that student loan indebtedness is a real issue, particularly for younger Americans, and in particular for Americans who didn't complete their college degree. Yes. You want to talk about the people who are most burdened. They don't get the economic benefit of the return of that investment from getting a degree.
Yeah, they were only able to do 1 or 2 years of school, and they're saddled, then they had to leave, and they're saddled with these loans, and without the degree, the credential to get the higher paying job.
It would have been better had our elected lawmakers had a debate around what problem do we want to solve and where can we come to an agreement on solving that, rather than the path that we've been down with executive action. But Joe, I think, summarized the economic impact correctly.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about China. It's been in the news, of course, the past few days with the continuing zero COVID policy and the lockdowns. And now we're seeing the protests with the protesters holding up the white piece of paper. We've talked before about how, you know, this COVID situation in China has led to big supply chain disruptions. It's led companies to begin not to source everything from China, but to look for other sources. What are your thoughts now on the situation in China and how it's going to impact the global economy?
Right, the mask is being ripped off China, in quotes, in a way. They attempted to create something called Sinovac rather than adopting our mRNA technology. And what we're really getting a look into is the true technological capacity of Beijing to deal with these modern challenges. And I got to tell you, it's not good. They simply don't have it. And now that we're decoupling from the Chinese economy, there's going to be a real problem on, you know, capital investment. There's going to be a problem around technology transfers. We're going to be relocating production centers all over Asia, South America, and back into North America. This is going to go on for a number of years, right? My sense is China is now going to see its growth decelerate. It's not only in a middle income trap, they're going to have a real problem because of the inherent instability inside their financial sector having to do with housing. China is facing what you call a polycrisis, a crisis on many fronts. I think if we were to come back in 3 to 5 years, we might be having a very different conversation about the Chinese and their role in the global economy than we had, say, 3 years ago.
Will they take a step back from being such a superpower, the second most powerful economy?
So the era of 10% growth is over. They're going to have 2% growth just like everybody else, probably for a long period of time. Then it's up to them in terms of their forward look in Northeast Asia, the strategic quadrangle between the United States, Russia, South Korea, Japan, and China. That's not really fundamentally an economic phenomena, so like everybody else, I'm going to sit and watch. But I do know this. The geopolitical tensions have resulted in a broad decoupling of the US, EU, UK, and Japan from China that's going to alter the global economic system. Sort of the fragmentation of trade that's going to occur will result in higher prices, longer term. The signal that I think we all watched over the past couple of months was Apple announcing that they were going to begin reducing their exposure to their supply chains in China to the point where they're going to begin producing chips in the Arizona desert that literally will cost 50% more than what they would have gotten out of China. That's a systemically important firm making a major decision, which is then sending a signal to all the other firms. So Neil and I will be having a discussion on, well, where are they going to relocate in Asia to have access to those wealthy markets? Is it Vietnam? Is it Malaysia? Is it India? We don't know, right? I do know this. There's going to be a lot of production coming back that's going to be much more expensive.
So it sounds like for middle market companies, they're going to have to pay more to produce their goods if they're getting the parts and things in the U.S. as opposed to the cheaper China market.
I think they have to be sophisticated about what kind of industry they're in and what they're sourcing in China, right? So in some ways, we have to be careful not to paint with too broad of a brush on what is happening in really national security centric industries. So, you know, if you are in semiconductors, if you are in telecommunications equipment, if you are in artificial intelligence, if you are in biopharmaceuticals, so that the things that can have a much broader impact, yes, I think that's exactly right. So you're rethinking that. If you're sourcing widgets for the widget that you're selling to consumers for their home that has nothing to do with technology, that may not fundamentally change. So I think in some ways we get consumed by the daily news of lockdowns and what that means for factory production in China, and we paint that as a picture of the future. That's a picture of the present. The picture of the future really is going to become differentiated based on technologies and industries and ultimately the decisions that the Chinese choose to make.
But this dynamic of no longer be able to go to cheap markets to get your supplies, but having to pay more, then you're going to pass it on to the consumers, then inflation remains high. That's why it's such a stubborn problem.
You already saw people pre-pandemic moving production out of China because it had become more costly to produce in China than it is in other Asian countries. So you're already seeing some trend lines moving in that direction, even before the latest tensions.
Do you think you're onto something, though, that the pandemic has unleashed some forces now that aren't going to change? And that the 1990 to 2020 era, which was largely defined by insufficient aggregate demand, low prices, low inflation, and low interest rates, we're now moving into a different era where we're going to have insufficient aggregate supply. There's going to be persistent supply shocks. And because of that, we're going to have higher prices, a little bit higher inflation, and probably higher interest rates than we've grown accustomed to, say, over the past 15 years. And so for middle market firms, this is going to entail an adjustment, right? But it's why we want to reinforce that idea. Keep investing in software, equipment, and intellectual property. You can't stop. You have to continue because that adjustment is going to come. And in part, it's going to be driven by national security priorities. And of course, we are seeing the money put on the table to stimulate the new production centers here in the United States around sophisticated technology.
And I believe the October survey results showed that middle market firms, a greater number for the first time, said they are having a little bit of a tougher time passing on prices. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that shift.
Okay, so we've gone through a 2-year period of inflation. Firms have adjusted to about as well as one could expect. They clearly have been passing through price increases. Well over 3/4 of the survey respondents for some time have been telling us. But in the fourth quarter of this year, when the survey was put to field in October and November, we did see a notable increase in firms reporting that they're now getting some resistance. They're just not able to pass along those prices. And that is in part why we have the 65% probability of a recession next year. Think of it this way, Darby. This past summer, in June, when the price of gasoline reached $5 a gallon on average across the country, that was the point at which demand destruction starts. People just weren't going to pay that or weren't able to pay that, and they began taking the bus, the subway, the train, ride sharing, increased demands to work from home. And what happened? Prices came back, right? We're now seeing that in the broader economy, not just in manufacturing, but really in the service sector also.
Let's talk about we talked about on the pre-call about the dichotomy between the low to middle income to the high income consumers and how you were talking about there's so much dry powder still. But explain what you mean by that.
Well, Joe's broken down the
Right.
quintiles, which is fascinating. You should share your
So
research.
1.7 trillion in excess savings compared to the pre-pandemic era is a lot of money, right? So at the Fed, we can break it down into the quartiles. I can make it into 5 different categories. Essentially, the upper 2 quintiles are sitting on about 1.35 trillion dry powder. The lower 3 quintiles, middle class, the working class, and the working poor, they're sitting on about 350 billion. The poor and the working class have blown through their savings. So basically, it's just the middle class has a reservoir left. Well, we're seeing them spend that right now around the country. We had a pretty decent holiday spending period, much better, I think, than people thought. Clearly robust online demand for all sorts of goods. And then at one point, when we have the holiday spending hangover next year, that's when we'll begin talking in a much more guarded way about, well, the economy may fall off a cliff at one point, but not right now.
January and February can be rough when those bills start coming in. Everybody's mood sours,
It can
right?
be, but think about the last 6 to 8 months, how every month when we were looking at retail sales, everyone was expecting, well, this is going to be the month.
Yep.
Well, nope, it wasn't the month.
Nope.
And it's still not the month because there are a large number of discretionary consumers who had a lot of wherewithal to make the purchases that they want to make, and they have not pulled back. Now, at some point, they may. At some point, they're going to run out of those excess reserves. But it creates a really interesting economic environment when you think about those folks who are often also very sensitive to values in the stock market. So much of what they have is type of investment. We've seen a lot of swings there, but it hasn't translated into their ability to continue consuming because they're setting on these levels of excess savings.
And we share widely the data visualizations and the data. If someone wants to take a look at it, please contact us, because we'll send it to you and we put a number on it, right? And we've got numbers through the middle of the year and an estimate on what happened in the third quarter. So about $250 billion in spending was blown in the third quarter of the year. But that still says 1.5 trillion going in the holiday season. That's a lot of dry powder. So we're doing okay. The economy's gone through these broad structural changes in the past 2 decades. The great financial crisis, followed by the pandemic. It's not the same economy. It doesn't operate the same way. And we're learning a lot more about the response function to different forms of policy. It wouldn't surprise me if in a couple years we're back sitting at around 3.5% inflation. We moved on. And we come to a different conclusion about the fiscal reaction in the Trump administration and the early portion of the Biden administration. And we might learn that, you know what, that wasn't the worst idea to do, was to create a series of cash payments to people to get them through the initial shock. Because if you take a look at where inflation was above 9%, heading to 10%, real income has fallen, we should have already been in recession. We're not. So now this isn't popular talk amongst people whose, say, policy and normative preferences are organized around 1970s and 1980s economics. I respect that and understand that, but things change. Our time passes and things change is probably the way to think about it. And what we're seeing here is a very different set of policies yielding very different outcomes.
One of the things I wanted to bring up was the part of the Inflation Reduction Act was additional funding to the Internal Revenue Service. So I wondered if middle market firms should be paying attention to this. It could be good news, perhaps in the terms of more services or better customer service, but it also could mean more enforcement actions. What is your take on it?
I think you said it exactly right. It could be both. And listen, the IRS is broken. I mean, they're processing things by paper that they move around in carts in large rooms. I mean, this is not the tax code is complicated enough. Think about everyone as you fill out your taxes and you manage that. Then imagine someone opening it and keystroking in what's on your returns or amended returns and moving that from one paper stack to another. So it's well overdue for need for investment. I think ultimately a lot of the additional money will actually go to those investments and those upgrades and to the staffing. if they make a political decision to put much more of it into enforcement rather than to customer service and speeding along processing times, I think there could be a backlash for the reasons you allude to. But I'm hopeful that they'll be judicious in using this investment to bring it into the modern age.
When we were all young, Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to always remind us that taxes pay for civilization. And if we want to have that infrastructure, we want it modern, and we want to compete with the Chinese, the Indians, and the Europeans, we have to pay for it. So it's just something to me that's given, and we have to do it.
Let's get an energy checkup. We've talked about this in past webcasts, and I know the Chamber is pushing for more domestic energy exploration and production. Where are we on that? And bring us up to date on what you're calling for the next year.
Well, it's cliche almost now, but it really is all of the above. We're a sophisticated country with sophisticated energy companies who can do two things at the same time. They can increase the current supply of energy, principally through oil and natural gas, while at the same time moving in the energy transition that we need for decarbonization in the future. And if you look at all the major energy companies, they're doing both of those things today. I think where we run into a little bit of a problem is making sure that we have a policy environment that's conducive to that transition. And the transition can't just be about the backside of making the investments in the clean energy. It's also facilitating the efficient movement of the energy that we need today. So when I look at energy transmission today, not just production, but transmission today, I look at the Northeast, where we can't get natural gas to fuel the Northeast and to heat homes. And then I look at electricity, where we're producing it. Joe lives in Texas. They're doing phenomenal things with renewable production in West Texas. The problem is that they need to get that to East Texas and to the other parts of the country, and we don't have the transmission lines to do that. So this isn't an either-or scenario. We need to increase the number of permits, and then we need to make it easier to move the energy that we have, both renewables and classic fossil fuels.
Couple things. Energy infrastructure is everything in 2023. We have to do this because it's part of the solution to the inflation challenge. Second, we can walk and chew gum in this country. We really can. Natural gas is going to provide the bridge to renewables, right? Where I live in Texas, 45% of our energy is provided by, our electricity is provided by wind. Nice company called Nucor Steel produces those. In Texas, they're creating the turbines, they're creating the stands that create the wind, right? We know how to do all this. It's just we have to get past the political noise first, I think.
I'm seeing a lot of solar roofs being installed on the old homes in the town I live in, and then in the new construction as well. So they're kind of popping up like mushrooms everywhere. It's really
And now they make them where they look like shingles.
Yes, you can get them to look like that. I was waiting for that. I want that more historic look. Okay, so I'll try to wrap up what I think are the key takeaways here. It sounds like you're saying, yes, the economy will go into recession, probably later half of next year, but it will be a shallow and short recession. Sounds better than what I hear from some other sources, which are more doomsday. What are the key risks? What are the things that keep you awake at night worrying about that could change that scenario?
Well, I think the first one is Monday, December 5th. We're going to impose a price cap on Russian oil exports. It's a very innovative policy, something an economist would think up, actually, using the global insurance market, which Brussels and London actually control, in order to redirect incentives to only move Russian oil at the pre-approved cap. So if the Russians were to retaliate and cut off all energy exports into the West, we'll probably have to come back and revisit some of these forecasts, not just around the recession, but around energy prices. So that's the first risk. The second big risk was the one we talked about earlier around uncertainty and fixed business investment. It's understandable. The first thing you want to do is just existing customers, sales, forget innovation. That's the wrong way to go right now, because what's causing this is the energy shock and the inflation shock.
So you're advising middle market firms to keep on investing in productivity enhancing technology.
That's right. It's a must-have at this point.
Okay. Anything else middle market businesses should be doing as we
I
prepare for the
I want to double down
next
on
year?
the last one Joe said, because I think this is the most important thing, because it will determine whether or not we enter a recession, the depths of the recession, but more importantly, how we come out of it and what the economy looks like on the other side. And so you can talk yourself into a recession, and you can talk yourself into a lower growth trend line over time if you've convinced that that's where we're headed. And so when I look at the concerns, that's probably a principal one. I think the second is that, and it's related, is that we have to have a serious conversation about labor supply. And if we don't understand that the future looks different than the past, we're not going to make the adjustments that we need to capitalize on that future.
Okay, well, I look forward to seeing how things play out as we go to the end of this year and into next year. Thank you very much, Joe Brusuelas and Neil Bradley. A great conversation today. I know everybody wants to get to see the World Cup game between the U.S. and Iran, so we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The Middle Market Business Index, the latest survey, will be posted on RSM's website on December 6th, so please check the website for that. Thank you so much, and have a great day.